There are moments in life that look ordinary until you look again, until you feel the air shift, like the calm before a storm you didn't know was coming. For Zack Pritchard, that moment came on a windless Tuesday in suburban Indiana, when everything seemed so still it almost dared him to breathe. Zack had once been the golden boy of Maple Ridge High, wide grin, quick legs, and a football jersey that carried more weight than he knew. But that image had been burned to the ground 6 weeks ago when a video surfaced. Not just any video, a grainy, sickening clip that captured him in the school hallway, shoving a younger boy into the lockers, mocking him with laughter that now felt like it came from someone else's mouth. No one spoke to Zack after that, not the teachers, not the teammates, not even Elena, who used to be the closest thing he had to a friend. The punishment from the school board was a joke. Community service, they said. No suspension, no expulsion. Just clean some kennels at the local shelter and maybe they'd all forget. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. Zack didn't forget. Not when the air was thick with silence in the cafeteria. Not when he saw the boy's mother pull him away in the grocery store parking lot. And certainly not when he arrived at the shelter that Friday afternoon, a sour taste already rising in his mouth. The place was quiet, tucked behind a faded strip mall, hidden by a row of tired oaks. It smelled of bleach and old fur. He signed. In at the counter with barely a nod to the woman there, a grey-haired volunteer who didn't smile. They didn't need to pretend to like him. He didn't pretend back. His first task was the kennels, row after row of cages that held the cast-offs of the county. Some barked, some whimpered, but most just watched, like they knew. Zack moved through them with half-hearted efficiency, eyes low, jaw tight. Then he saw him. At the end of the corridor, in the last enclosure, a large German shepherd sat perfectly still. Not curled, not panting, just watching. His coat was thick but unkempt. A patch of skin beneath his left ear was bald and puckered, scar tissue. There was no nameplate on his gate, just a strip of masking tape with one word, Kane. Zack smirked more to himself than anything. What, like a cop dog? He knelt near the gate. You some kind of big deal? Kane didn't move. Zack clicked his tongue and poked a finger through the mesh. What, too good to bark? The dog's head turned sharply. His eyes locked onto Zack's. There was no growl, no bark, just silence. But the kind that fills your chest with cold. Zack blinked and pulled back his hand. Weird mutt. Still, something gnawed at the back of his mind. He knew fear. He knew rage. He'd worn both, like armor. But this dog, he wasn't scared of Zack. He wasn't interested. He looked at Zack the way Zack's father used to, before he left, like he saw right through him. Later, as Zack mopped the front room, he caught the shelter supervisor watching him through the glass door. A man in his 50s, thin and sun-browned, arms folded tight. His name tag read, Rourke. That dog, Rourke said, nodding toward the kennel wing. Don't get clever with him. Zack didn't look up. It's just a dog. Rourke's voice was flat. He's not here for long, and he's not yours to provoke. Didn't touch him, Zack said too quickly. Rourke left without another word. On the walk home, Zack kicked at the crumbling sidewalk. The sun was setting behind the houses, each window glowing orange like a line of small fires. He hated how the silence followed him. Hated how Kane's eyes stayed in his memory, cold, judging. His phone buzzed, a notification. Comments piling up again under the video. He didn't even check them. He already knew the words. He stuffed the phone deep in his pocket and kept walking, fists clenched. Back at the shelter, under flickering lights, Kane still sat motionless in his cage. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. But when Zack's shadow crossed his gate earlier, Kane had stirred, a flicker of something different, familiar. And now, as darkness fell, the shepherd lifted his head and stared into the hallway's emptiness, as if waiting, as if remembering. The next afternoon came, dressed in grey skies and cold wind, And not after what came to light about the chain of cover-ups that reached beyond their town, beyond their state, into the highest levels of privatized corrections and behavioral science. But progress didn't require everything to change at once, just enough to keep it moving. The federal task force issued its final report 6 months later. Over 70 former contractors and officials were indicted. 4 new laws were proposed, and 1 was signed. It included federal protections for animals used in unlawful testing or abusive correctional programs, and in a first-of-its-kind clause, acknowledged trauma-based behavioral responses from such animals as admissible supporting evidence when tied to corroborated abuse. They called it the Kane provision. Zack didn't watch the signing ceremony on TV. He didn't need to. He was at the shelter that day, repainting the rebuilt kennels with a small group of volunteers. Kane laid nearby, sun on his back, eyes half closed, tail flicking occasionally as Zack worked. The new facility had a wing named in his honor, the Kane Center for Recovery and Protection, and its mission wasn't just rescue, it was memory, training, and healing. That evening, Zack walked Kane through the school one last time, not as punishment, not as surveillance, just as something symbolic. They passed the lockers he used to slam kids into, the hallway where the video had captured the worst version of himself. Now murals covered those walls, painted by students inspired by Kane. They weren't about pain, they were about survival, resilience, forgiveness. In the final hallway, just before the exit doors, Kane stopped, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Zack followed his gaze. At the end of the corridor stood a new display case. Inside it, Kane's old intake collar from the shelter, his vest, and a replica of the flash drive that had started it all. Above it, etched into the glass, not all witnesses speak, some just refuse to forget. Zack stood there, hand resting gently on Kane's shoulder. The hallway was quiet, not empty, just still. Outside, students gathered in the courtyard. Some recognized Kane. Some only knew the story. They greeted him with quiet waves, not excitement, respect. Kane walked beside Zack to the center of the courtyard, where a new stone had been laid into the ground. On it, just one word, witness. Zack sat beside it, and Kane laid down beside him. The sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the stone. But this time, the shadows didn't carry fear. They carried memory, and memory, real, unflinching, impossible to silence, was what changed everything. Kane closed his eyes. Zack leaned back against the warm concrete, his hand resting on the dog's fur. For the first time in a long, long while, they didn't need to say anything. They had already spoken. The term trauma-responsive animal witness was being debated in legal journals, and Kane, he became more than a case file. He became a symbol. His story appeared in textbooks, ethics classes, podcasts. People wore shirts with his vest logo, witness, but beyond the headlines and the hashtags, something quieter mattered more. He was safe. Zack had fought for that with every ounce of strength he had left. And in doing so, he'd found something worth believing in again. There were still threats. Of course there were. Men in suits who lurked too long in hallways, anonymous messages, a suspicious break-in at Mr. Chavez's office that somehow triggered. No alarm. But those threats no longer ruled them, because the silence wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the people who hid behind it. Kane attended one last hearing before the federal committee. No camera crews this time, just a round room of tired officials and scarred witnesses. One by one, survivors told their stories. Some cried. Some didn't. Some just sat beside Kane, hands shaking as they whispered thanks. One boy, barely 14, placed his hand on Kane's back and said, "I remembered the sound of his breathing. That's how I got through the nights. I just listened. I didn't feel alone." Zack sat across from them and realized something he hadn't been able to admit before. Kane didn't just remember the pain, he carried it, so others wouldn't have to. When they left the building, Elena took a photo. Just Kane and Zack, walking side by side, the Capitol dome blurred in the background. She posted it without a caption. It went viral within the hour. The headline from one news outlet read, "The dog who wouldn't forget taught a nation to remember." That night, as Zack watched the reposts and retweets pile up, he closed the laptop and looked down at Kane. "We're almost there," he whispered. "Just one more step." Kane opened his eyes, and in the stillness of that room, Zack could feel it. Not peace, but something stronger, a promise that no matter how far they still had to go, they wouldn't stop walking. Not until every name was remembered. Not until the last lie crumbled under the weight of the truth Kane refused to let die. The auditorium buzzed with quiet anticipation. It had been repainted since the last time Zack stood on that stage. The cracked lighting fixtures were fixed, the ceiling tiles replaced, and even the old clock that had been frozen at 2:17 for the past year now ticked quietly above the exit sign. But what had truly changed wasn't the building. It was the people inside it. Zack looked out across the room and saw students who used to flinch when they heard his name, teachers who once pretended not to see him in the halls, parents who had once whispered and pointed. Now they sat in silence, waiting. He took a breath and stepped up to the microphone. "This used to be a place where I thought silence kept me safe," he began, his voice steady but low. "Where I thought that looking the other way meant I couldn't be blamed. I bullied people here. Some of you saw it, some of you let it happen, and I let myself believe that cruelty was power." He paused, eyes scanning the front row. "But I was wrong. And the only reason I ever figured that out was because of a dog." The curtain behind him opened slowly, revealing Kane standing beside Elena. He wore the same black vest, now updated with a gold pin above the word "witness." His posture was calm, but his eyes scanned the room with the same quiet intensity he'd always carried. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. "Some of you might already know Kane's story," Zack said, "about what he survived, about what he remembered, when no one else would. But today isn't just about the past, it's about what comes next." He motioned toward the far wall, where a new plaque had been installed beside the school's honor board. Beneath the engraved title, "Legacy and Remembrance," it listed the names of the boys identified from the files, every known survivor, and the 5 who had never been found. "I promised myself I wouldn't let their names disappear again," Zack continued, "and I promised Kane I'd never let silence win." The auditorium stayed quiet, but the emotion in the air was thick enough to feel. In the days that followed, things didn't return to normal, because there was no going back to what normal had been. Not after the investigations, not after the trials. And now he's not the only one. That clip aired around the world. The story spread beyond politics into hearts and homes. Schools discussed it, families argued about it over dinner, and survivors, so many, began to come forward. Some had no proof, just stories. Some brought photos, wristbands, medical files that had quietly vanished from hospitals years ago. Every one of them said the same thing. They remembered. And Kane had given them the courage to say it out loud. Elena's documentary went live 3 days later. It wasn't polished. It wasn't flashy. It was raw and cut together with urgency. Interviews with survivors, former officers, Zack, Mr. Chavez, and of course Kane, silent, steady, the anchor in every frame. The title was simple, "The Dog Who Wouldn't Forget." It went viral overnight. A week later, 2 contractors were indicted. 3 officials resigned, and Kane was moved to a protected residence under federal watch. But he didn't sleep there. He slept in Zack's room, at the foot of the bed. Every night Elena called it symbolic. Mr. Chavez called it stubborn. But Zack didn't care. He'd promised Kane safety, and now he could finally deliver on it. Still, the threat hadn't vanished. The deeper Operation Echo dug, the more opposition it faced. Funding vanished. Witnesses were threatened. A federal agent was hospitalized after his car mysteriously exploded outside his home. "They're not done," Elena warned, staring at her computer screen late one night. "They're regrouping, preparing a narrative. Discredit the whole thing as a hoax or political stunt." Zack nodded slowly. "Then we hit first." "How?" "We find the names behind the money." They worked through the night, cross-referencing donor lists, lobbying records, shell companies. By morning they had something solid, a name, someone powerful, untouchable, a retired state senator who had once chaired the committee that approved emergency contracts for juvenile corrections. His signature appeared on funding approvals, security contracts, and most damning, on a classified document authorizing behavioral testing protocols on non-verbal subjects. He had signed off on using Kane, and Zack was going to put that name in every headline he could find. They weren't just telling Kane's story anymore, they were finishing it, and the world wasn't just listening, it was ready to fight back. Zack stood on the edge of the school auditorium stage, staring at the crowd that had packed every row. Parents, students, teachers, even some of the quiet skeptics who had avoided eye contact with him in the halls for months. The lights dimmed, the projector flickered, and on the screen behind him Kane's face appeared, his eyes fixed on something beyond the lens, his body still, but alert. Zack didn't speak for a moment. He let the image hang there, quiet and commanding. "This is the dog I met at a shelter when I thought I had nothing left," he said finally. "He didn't bark, he didn't move, but he looked at me like he already knew me, like he'd been waiting for someone to see him. Not just as an animal, but as a witness." The crowd was silent. Zack continued. "They tried to erase him, first from duty, then from the records, then from the world. But Kane didn't forget. He didn't forget the boys he was forced to watch suffer. He didn't forget the ones he tried to protect. And when the world told him to lie down and stay quiet, he stood. He stepped aside as Elena played a clip from her documentary. Kane's low growl at the courthouse, the boy dropping to his knees, the judge's voice acknowledging him as a witness. Then the flashbacks, footage of the warehouse, the cages, the chains. The room stayed hushed. When the video ended, the applause started slow, then swelled until the walls trembled with it. But Zack didn't smile. This wasn't victory. This was survival. Later that night, Kane slept at the foot of Zack's bed as he always did. But now his ears didn't twitch at every sound. His muscles didn't stay coiled like springs. He still dreamed, sometimes with soft whimpers, but Zack had learned to reach down and place his hand on Kane's back when it happened. Just enough to remind him he wasn't alone. Operation Echo had sparked change. 3 states launched their own investigations. A federal oversight committee opened a probe into all juvenile correction programs that received private security funding between 2009 and 2021. Elena uploaded the footage that night. Hours later, it was trending on every major platform. Kane leaping between a handler and a simulated threat. Kane locating a missing child in under 5 minutes. Kane refusing to bite, even under extreme pressure, until the command came, not from a man, but from a child pretending to cry. He sat, waiting, listening. The footage shattered the image painted by the smear campaign. But with it came the blowback. 2 nights later, the retired officer who leaked the location was found dead in his garage. Suicide? The official report. Read. Zack didn't believe it. Neither did anyone who'd been paying attention. The message was clear. Get too close and you vanish. But instead of fear, the public reaction exploded. Protests erupted outside City Hall. A petition to reinstate Officer Barnes passed 100,000 signatures. News networks began asking uncomfortable questions live on air. A senator called for an independent investigation, and then came the knock on Zack's door. 2 men in suits, no badges, no names. "We're here to take custody of the dog," one of them said. Zack stood in the doorway, Kane beside him, calm and silent. "No," Zack said. The man smiled coldly. "You don't have a choice." Zack's voice didn't rise. "You're not taking him." The second man stepped forward, Kane growled, deep, measured. The kind of sound that makes something ancient stir in your chest. The kind of sound that says, "Not this time." Mr. Chavez appeared behind Zack, phone in hand. "You're being recorded. Step off the property." The men hesitated, then they turned and walked away. No threats, no promises, just a look that said it wasn't over. But Zack already knew that. The enemy wasn't just out there anymore. It was in the system, in the silence, in the way truth got twisted into paperwork and buried in concrete. But this time, the silence had teeth, and a name, and the eyes of a nation watching. Rain swept across the rooftops in steady waves, soaking the courthouse steps, where protesters still gathered under umbrellas. Their signs, blurred by the downpour, bobbed up and down in unison like the heartbeat of something that refused to die. Kane watched them through the car window, calm as ever, his breath fogging, the glass in slow, steady rhythms. Zack sat beside him, one hand on the leash, the other gripping his knee tight enough to leave marks. Inside the courthouse, chaos had turned into strategy. After the footage leaked of Kane's early training, footage that painted him as a disciplined, compassionate protector, the pressure on state authorities grew impossible to ignore. Petitions crossed 1 million signatures, journalists descended on the town, and somewhere in the swirl of exposure and outrage, something cracked wide open. A special task force was formed. The name was unofficial, but the media latched onto it. Operation Echo, a coordinated investigation into the now defunct juvenile rehabilitation initiative, its financial backers, contracted handlers, and the systemic corruption that had protected it. It wasn't just about Kane anymore. It was about the dozens, maybe hundreds of children lost in the program, many of whom had never been officially registered in any database. Zack was no longer a lone voice in the dark. He was now a witness. So was Kane. Their first stop was Washington. An emergency session of a Congressional Oversight Committee requested Kane's presence, and while no law required a dog to testify, a legal team drafted a resolution naming Kane a survivor witness under federal protection. It passed, barely. It was the first time in U.S. history that a non-human was granted protected status in an abuse case of this scale. At the Capitol, Kane was led through security with his vest on, eyes sharp, tail low. The cameras were relentless, the crowd electric. When Zack stepped behind the podium and told their story, how the dog he'd once mocked had taught him what survival really looked like, not a single seat in the chamber was empty. He spoke of silence, of scars that couldn't be seen, of children whose names had never been written down. He played clips of Kane freezing when he saw certain uniforms, of him growling at men tied to the original program, and of the moment a rescued teen dropped to his knees in recognition. This dog remembered. "What all of you chose to forget," Zack said into the mic. "He remembered because he had to. But Kane never attacked a soul who didn't deserve it. He survived things no one should have lived through, and when he had the chance, he protected the ones weaker than him. I wish I could say the same about myself, but I'm trying now, because Kane taught me that being strong doesn't mean being cruel. It means standing between the pain and the people who can't stop it." When he stepped down, the crowd was silent. Then someone started clapping, then more, until the sound filled the block. The petition to cancel the euthanasia order reached 50,000 signatures by nightfall. Then came the surprise. An officer, a real one this time, not a hired enforcer, came forward anonymously. Then a second. Both had worked adjacent to the juvenile program. Both had been told to stay out of it. Both had stories. They filed formal affidavits under federal protection. The tide was shifting. One reporter called it the first visible crack in the wall. But Zack knew better. The wall wasn't cracking. It was preparing to fall, and when it did, he'd be standing next to the dog who never forgot what it meant to fight. The call came just after midnight. Mr. Chavez answered it first, and when he handed the phone to Zack, his face said everything. Something had gone wrong. They arrested him. Elena said on the other end. Her voice wasn't panicked. It was too controlled, too focused. The officer who gave the affidavit, Barnes. He's in county lockup. Obstruction of justice. No bail. Zack felt the world slow around him. On what evidence? None that'll hold, she said, but it's enough to scare off the others. By morning, news of the arrest was buried beneath headlines about a new budget crisis and a celebrity divorce. The local coverage was minimal. 2 paragraphs, no photo, tucked between a city council blurb and a weather forecast. But Kane noticed. That morning, as Zack clipped on his leash, Kane didn't sit as he usually did. He paced, slowly, deliberately, nose to the wind. Zack didn't need words to understand it. Kane sensed the shift, the fear creeping back into the cracks they'd opened, the pressure building on the other side of the truth. At school, Zack found his locker covered in red. Paint. 2 words scrawled across the metal. Stay silent. He left it there, didn't wipe it down. Just opened the dented door and pulled out his books like nothing had happened. But when he found Elena in the journalism room, she was already 1 step ahead. They're scared, she said. That's the only reason to do something this sloppy. You didn't think it was someone inside? She didn't look up from her keyboard. I think it was someone desperate, and those are the ones that make mistakes. By lunch, they got another lead. A local shelter volunteer, retired cop, quiet, off the grid, emailed Elena a name. Thomas Riley. A former handler who once worked with Kane before the transfer, supposedly disappeared after refusing to retrain the dog under the new behavioral protocol. Elena traced a property deed to an abandoned orchard 2 counties over. They left that afternoon. The drive was long, quiet. Kane rode in the back seat, eyes alert, body tense. When they pulled up to the orchard, Zack could see why the man had vanished. The place was in ruins, half the trees dead, the rest overgrown. A rusted trailer sat near the tree line, its windows darkened. Zack knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door opened just enough to reveal a lined face and tired eyes. You brought him, the man said. Kane stepped forward. For a long second, no one spoke. Then Thomas Riley opened the door fully. Inside, the trailer was dim but clean. A wood stove glowed in the corner. Riley sat slowly, rubbing his hands together. They came for me too, back when I said no. No to what? Zack asked. To turning Kane into something he's not. Riley leaned back. He was trained to protect. That's who he was. But the program changed. They wanted obedience over instinct, fear over judgment. When he wouldn't comply, they marked him defective. Because he wouldn't hurt kids? Zack asked. Because he chose not to. Riley reached into a drawer and pulled out a flash drive. I kept 1 copy, just in case they ever came back. I guess they have. Zack took it, heart pounding. What's on it? Handler footage, real training sessions, pre-program. You'll see who he really is. They didn't wait. This time wearing a service vest. It bore no emblem, just a word. Witness. The judge began slowly. After reviewing the behavioral evidence, the corroborating documents and the testimonial record, this court acknowledges that the animal in question displays consistent conditioned trauma response tied directly to previously undocumented human abuse. Gasps echoed. Cameras clicked. This court accepts the behavioral responses of the canine identified as Kane as admissible under evidentiary rules regarding trauma verification, provided a licensed behavioral specialist remains involved. Zack didn't fully hear the rest. He felt his legs wobble under him. Elena clutched his arm tightly, her face unreadable except for the tears in her eyes. They hadn't won. Not yet, but the door was open. After the hearing, a boy was brought in quietly through the back. 17, thin, nervous, one of the names from the files. He hadn't spoken in months, according to his advocate, but when he saw Kane, his breath caught. He dropped to his knees, reached out, and whispered the dog's name. Kane walked to him and rested his head on the boy's chest. That moment broke whatever silence had remained in the court's foundation. Kane wasn't just a survivor, he was the only witness they couldn't silence, and now the system had to answer. The story spread like fire. Within 48 hours of the court's decision, Kane's image was everywhere, on national morning shows, podcasts, political panels. News anchors called it a landmark moment in evidentiary law. Activists labeled him the first trauma-certified witness without a voice. But none of the attention brought peace. If anything, it made things worse. By the third day, someone threw a brick through Elena's kitchen window. No note this time, just glass, splinters, and the reminder that power doesn't vanish quietly. That night, her father stood guard on the porch, a loaded revolver tucked behind his waistband. He didn't try to stop her from writing, but the look in his eyes said more than his silence ever could. Zack barely left the house. His mom had finally started paying attention, not to what he said, but to the noise around him. He heard her arguing with someone over the phone, her voice cracking as she asked what it meant for her son to be mixed up in this federal thing. She didn't know how deep it went. Neither did he, not really. But Kane did. The shelter fire hadn't broken the momentum. If anything, it had built sympathy. Anonymous donations poured in to rebuild the structure. Volunteer applications tripled, but behind the curtain, forces were still shifting. Quiet meetings, legal threats, memos leaked to reporters and quickly pulled. A few brave officials called for a deeper investigation. Most stayed silent. Then, without warning, the euthanasia order on Kane reappeared, filed quietly by a local clerk, backdated. No public notice. Just a sealed motion entered in a side courtroom under the guise of public safety risk mitigation. A whistleblower caught it by accident and sent the file to Mr. Chavez. When Zack saw the document, he felt sick. They're still trying to erase him. No, Chavez said. They're trying to bait us, make us overreact, look unstable. They want to turn the narrative. Zack shook his head. They picked the wrong story. Elena was already pulling names. She tracked the clerk's recent activity, found connections to 3 private contractors with ties to the old juvenile program. One of them had made direct political donations to a judge whose name kept showing up on quiet suppression orders. It wasn't just rot. It was an entire system engineered to protect itself. They decided to go back to the courthouse, this time not with more data, but with people. By Friday morning, the front lawn of the county courthouse was filled with students, teachers, veterans, shelter workers, and survivors. A makeshift podium was set up with donated speakers. Kane arrived in a van, wrapped in photos of the facility ruins and the children who had vanished through them. He wore his vest, the one with the word that had changed everything. Witness. Zack stepped up to the microphone first. He didn't read from a paper. He didn't even rehearse. He just looked at the crowd and spoke from the place inside him that used to be empty, but now burned with something harder than guilt. You called him dangerous, he said, voice cracking but clear. The judge is allowing a preliminary evaluation. Kane's going in with you. Zack stood. With me? Chavez nodded. They want to see the bond. Inside the courtroom, Kane walked at Zack's side, calm but alert. The gallery was half full, press, a few local officials, and 2 men Zack recognized from the footage. They sat near the back, stone-faced, watching. The judge didn't speak at first, just watched as Zack and Kane approached. The prosecutor began laying out the foundation, the footage, the files, the photos, but it wasn't until Zack stood before the bench, his voice shaking but clear, that the room truly fell silent. I used to be the kind of person who hurt people, he said. I know what it looks like, what it feels like, that dog. He didn't turn away from it, he stepped into it, and he's never been able to speak. So I'm doing it for him. Then came the moment they'd all prepared for. The judge called for the playback of one video, Kane's attempted protection of a wounded child. And when the man from the footage was asked to stand, Kane growled, not violently, not wildly, just one low, soul-deep growl that made every hair on Zack's arm rise. The courtroom stilled. The judge leaned forward. Kane's body stood rigid, his eyes locked on the man's face with a focus that couldn't be mistaken. Not instinct. Recognition. The prosecutor sat down without another word, and for the first time, Zack saw the system flinch. The courthouse hallway was unnaturally quiet after the hearing, like the building itself was holding its breath. Kane sat at Zack's feet, unmoving, his head held high and eyes sharp. A bailiff passed, slowing just enough to glance down at the German shepherd with something close to reverence. Zack didn't speak. Neither did Elena. Neither had to. The room they just walked out of had shifted something, not enough to win, but enough to be noticed. Inside the courtroom, the judge had postponed an official ruling. She'd called it unprecedented and legally complex, but Zack had seen something in her eyes when Kane growled, that split second of truth cracking through a wall of doubt. For once, silence had spoken louder than any testimony. Outside, a crowd had started to gather. Reporters with cameras, microphones, and forced smiles. Protesters with signs that read, "Protect the forgotten and let Kane speak." But others were there too. Men in pressed suits with earbuds and sunglasses, watching quietly from street corners. No logos, no press credentials, just silent threats. Wrapped in anonymity, Mr. Chavez joined them at the courthouse steps. "They want to bury this," he said. "Every hour this goes on, they lose more ground. But they're going to come harder now." Zack didn't ask how he knew. He just believed him. Back at the Chavez house, Elena pulled up her laptop and logged into the private server. The downloads from the facility, the last files, had finally decrypted. Among them were court-sealed documents, juvenile medical records, signed compliance logs, even contracts from security firms authorizing behavioral interventions. One of the names on the signature line matched a sitting city council member. Another was a donor to a local election campaign. "They've got their hands in everything," Elena whispered. "Law enforcement, politics, schools, they didn't just erase evidence. They built a wall around it. Then we tear it down," Zack said. He uploaded the documents to a secure drop with a national investigative reporter known for taking on deep corruption cases. Elena followed with an encrypted email containing all the verified footage, Kane's history, and contact information. By morning, it was everywhere. Social media blew up with hashtags. News outlets scrambled to verify the data. An op-ed ran in. The local paper with the headline, "The Dog That Remembered What We Chose to Forget." At school, Zack walked through the halls unnoticed for the first time in months. Not ignored, but something else. Students watched him, not with the old disgust, but with uncertainty, some curious, some quiet with guilt. Then he saw Elena down the corridor, standing at her locker. Someone had slipped a note into the vent. She held it up, reading aloud. "Keep pushing. We've got your back." Zack smiled for the first time in days. Later that week, the judge reconvened the courtroom. This time, it was full. Press, state attorneys, even outside legal observers. Kane entered with Zack again, like he never existed. Elena sat beside him, her voice hard. "We have the videos, the files, the eyewitnesses." "They're calling the kids runaways," Zack said. "Calling me unstable, saying Kane was dangerous." Mr. Chavez poured a glass of water and handed it over. "It doesn't matter. The public saw it, and some are starting to listen. But we need more, something they can't bury." Zack nodded, the weight of it settling in his chest. "They took him," he said. "They think that's the end." "But it's just the beginning," Elena answered, "because the system hadn't anticipated what Kane left behind. Not just evidence, but a boy who wouldn't stop and a growing storm that even they wouldn't be able to silence." Zack couldn't sleep. Not anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw cages, chains, Kane's eyes blinking slowly through smoke. He replayed the footage over and over until it stopped being shocking and became something else, something that demanded justice. The news called it unsubstantiated. Officials denied the shelter was targeted. And Kane, he was simply missing. No further questions, no investigation, but Zack had stopped waiting for someone else to act. He was going to make sure they heard Kane, even if the world didn't believe a dog could testify. The idea had started as a joke. One of Elena's half-awake, half-angry rants. If Kane could stand up in court and just look at those people, we wouldn't need any of this. But Zack hadn't laughed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized. She was right. No jury would look at a series of grainy videos and make the connection. But if they saw Kane's reaction in real time, if they saw what trauma looked like in muscle and instinct, it could shift everything. The problem was finding him. That's when Zack did something reckless. He walked into the courthouse with a folder full of photos and files and asked to speak to a juvenile advocate. Not a cop, not a teacher. Someone who listened to kids when no one else would. He sat across from a woman with a tired face and kind eyes and told her everything, didn't hold back. He showed her the pictures, the building, the flash drive. He didn't beg her to believe. He just gave her the truth, unfiltered. Then he said the thing no one else had dared say out loud. I want to petition to have a canine dog recognized as a material witness in a child abuse investigation. She blinked. Once. Then again. That's not how the law works, she said. And quietly, I know, Zack replied, but laws can change. They just need someone angry enough to do it. He left her office thinking it was over, but the next day she called him back. There's a way, she said. It's a long shot. You'd need testimony, a judge willing to hear it, and most important, you'd need that dog. Zack swallowed. Then we find him. It took 3 days, and the quiet cooperation of 2 animal rights investigators who had seen the footage online and believed it was real. They traced the last known transfer route from the shelter and found a holding facility run by a private security firm just outside state lines. Elena and Zack drove there in silence. The car, thick with the weight of everything that could go wrong. The building was surrounded by barbed wire and men in dark uniforms. No signage, no open entrance. But when the agents showed their federal credentials, real or forged, Zack never asked. The gates opened. Kane was there, thinner, quiet, but alive. When Zack stepped into the room, Kane stood immediately. No bark, no whine, just one slow movement forward, his nose brushing against Zack's hand like it had never left. The facility's director protested, said Kane was being evaluated for aggression, that his record marked him as unstable, but the agents had paperwork now, real orders, signed by the advocate's office. Kane wasn't being held as evidence anymore. He was the evidence. Back in town, word spread fast. A hearing was scheduled, not a trial, not yet, but an emergency session to determine whether Kane's behavior, tied with the released footage, could be considered testimonial, behavioral response used as proof of trauma in a broader abuse case. Zack sat outside the courtroom the morning of the hearing, his foot tapping uncontrollably. You think they'll even let him in? He asked. They have to, Elena said. He's the only witness left. Mr. Chavez walked out of the courtroom, his face unreadable. It's happening, he said. Her father paced in front of the television, which now played a breaking news segment. An anonymous source had sent footage of a government-affiliated juvenile correction program using K9 enforcement. It was blurry, choppy, but it was out. Zack ran into the room, Kane by his side. Elena's eyes widened, relief washing over her face. You got out. They tried to kill him, Zack said. Again, Mr. Chavez looked between them. That footage is going to be denied, discredited, but I made calls. Quiet ones, people are listening now. Zack pulled the flash drive from his pocket. There's more. Mr. Chavez took it with trembling hands. This won't stop them, he said, but it's a start. Kane lay at Zack's feet, breathing steady, wounded, but not broken. The truth was out, and the fire had only just begun. Zack never thought he'd be arrested for trying to save a dog's life, but by noon the next day, he was in handcuffs. No Miranda. Warning. No official charges. Just a pair of officers with blank faces showing up at Elena's house and calling it protective custody. Mr. Chavez shouted at them, threatened legal action, demanded a warrant. They didn't listen. They barely looked at him. Zack was placed in the back of the cruiser like some delinquent caught tagging walls or skipping court. Kane watched from the porch as they took him, unmoving, unmuzzled, and completely still, his eyes following the car until it disappeared from the block. He wasn't brought to the station. Not the real one, anyway. They parked behind a municipal annex on the edge of town, walked him through a back door, and sat him in a room with no cameras, no windows, no clock. An hour passed, then another. Finally a woman entered, mid-40s. Blazer, expensive heels, government badge tucked just far enough inside her coat that Zack couldn't see the agency. She sat across from him, crossed her legs and said, "You've made quite the mess." Zack stared at her, his wrists cuffed, to the table. "Is that what this is about? Cleaning up?" She smiled, thin and rehearsed. "You're a minor. You don't understand the damage you've done. The footage you and your friend released is being circulated without context. You've endangered ongoing investigations." "You mean I told?" "The truth. Your truth is incomplete. You're hurting kids," Zack said. "You were going to kill a dog to keep it quiet. That animal is classified property. He's trained, dangerous. He protected people. He protected me." The woman leaned forward slightly. "Zack, we don't need to escalate this. You're not on trial yet. This is a conversation, one where you can decide what kind of future you want." "I want Kane safe," she tilted her head, "and if that's not possible, then I'll burn every one of your offices to the ground with the truth." The woman didn't flinch, but she stood. "You're not the first to make that threat. Most don't get a second chance." She left. 2 hours later, Zack was released. No paperwork, no charges. Just a silent officer unlocking the cuffs and walking him out into the parking lot, where Mr. Chavez waited in a black sedan, engine running. Zack got in without speaking. "They wanted to scare you," Chavez said, eyes on the road. "And they're escalating fast. The files we sent out, they're already calling them fabrications. What about the facility? Already stripped, empty, sanitized, no trace left. What about Kane?" Chavez hesitated. "They took him, transferred him somewhere off record. Not even animal control has the file. He's disappeared again." Zack's throat tightened. "They're going to kill him, not if we stay smart." Elena was waiting when they arrived. She pulled Zack into a hug before he could protest and whispered, "They think they've won." He stepped back. "They haven't." But when he walked into the living room and saw the television, his breath caught. A reporter stood outside the burned remains of a suburban shelter, smoke still curling from the rubble. Zack stumbled closer. "This morning, firefighters responded to a blaze at the Fairlawn Animal Rescue Shelter. While investigators suspect arson, no suspects have been named. Several animals were recovered, but one, a German shepherd named Kane, was reportedly missing at the time of the fire. Shelter staff claim he had been transferred hours earlier. Officials declined to comment." Zack dropped onto the couch, the room spinning. "They're erasing him," he whispered. Only when they reached a service road did Zack drop to one knee, lungs burning. Kane stood beside him, unmoving, eyes scanning the road. Zack looked at him and whispered, "You're not a weapon." Kane didn't blink. He already knew that. He was something else now, and with Zack beside him, he was ready to finish what they'd both started. The trees blurred past as Zack ran, low branches slapping his shoulders, the forest floor slick from recent rain. Kane kept just ahead, not running blindly, but carving a path like he'd done it 100 times before. He didn't bark. He didn't panic. He moved with purpose, checking back every few strides to make sure Zack was still there. Behind them, the shouting had stopped. The gunfire had faded, but that didn't mean they were safe. Whoever those men were, they hadn't come alone. Zack knew enough now to recognize the pattern. First threats, then smears, and finally erasure. They weren't just trying to silence him. They were trying to wipe Kane off the map. He followed Kane down a slope, nearly twisting his ankle in. A tangle of roots. The service road appeared through the trees like a lifeline, cracked and overgrown, but open enough for escape. Kane stopped abruptly, body stiff, ears pricked. "What is it?" Zack whispered, crouching beside him. Kane sniffed. The air then turned back toward the tree line. Zack's phone buzzed in his pocket. "A text from Elena. I saw the video. They're coming after us. I sent it to my dad." Zack's heart jumped. Elena's dad, Alan Chavez, was a county prosecutor, a cautious man, one who'd never trusted Zack, but he was also someone who might still believe in laws that meant something. Before Zack could respond, the distant hum of engines broke the stillness. "Not cars. ATVs, fast, close. We have to go," he said, but Kane didn't move. Then Zack heard it. Voices behind them, and not just from one direction. They were being boxed in. His eyes darted across the road. Up ahead was a drainage tunnel, half hidden beneath a fallen tree. Without a word, he sprinted for it, Kane right behind him. They slid inside, water shallow but cold, the concrete walls slick with moss. It wasn't safe, but it was cover. They crawled for 10 yards before the tunnel opened into a culvert that cut under the road. On the other side was a rocky incline, leading back toward the edge of town. Zack's knees ached by the time they reached it. Kane pushed ahead, ever watchful. Above them, a single ATV passed by. Then another. Neither slowed. They moved again, staying low until lights began appearing between the trees, security lamps, electric fencing, and beyond it, the outline of an industrial building. Zack recognized it immediately. The other facility. One of the satellite locations Elena had uncovered. They'd called it closed, condemned, but the lights were on. Kane didn't hesitate. He moved along the perimeter, nose to the fence. Zack followed, heart pounding. They found an opening near the loading dock. Someone had cut the wire recently. Inside, the place smelled of antiseptic and oil. The floors were polished concrete, the halls wide and the doors thick. No cages this time, just rooms. Small, sterile, windowless. Zack took out his phone. No signal. He started recording anyway. Down one hall, they found a command center. Monitors, maps, file cabinets with red tags. Kane stopped at one screen that showed a live feed from the shelter. Zack leaned in. Kane's kennel was empty. 3 men stood nearby, talking. One held a syringe. They were going to fake an overdose. "This is how they do it," Zack said softly. "They make it look clean." A sound behind them made Kane whip around. Footsteps. Zack grabbed a flash drive from the desk and bolted for the side exit. Kane followed, silent and swift. Alarms blared instantly. Zack didn't stop running. He dodged through a hallway, kicked open a fire door, and burst into the back lot. Kane lunged at one of the men who blocked the exit, took him down cleanly. Jaws clamped around his arm, but not tearing, just enough to disable. Zack reached the car parked near the far fence. Unlocked. He didn't ask why. He didn't care. They jumped in. Keys were in the ignition. He turned them. The engine roared. Tires screamed. They crashed through the gate, down the hill, back into the trees. He didn't stop driving until the town lights flickered through the windshield. At Elena's house, everything was chaos. No confrontation. Just Zack, a leash, and the dog who followed him without question. Kane didn't need words. The second he stepped into the open air, he changed. Not into a different animal, but into one that had been waiting. Every step beside, Zack was controlled, quiet, like he was on mission again. They drove in his mom's old sedan, the one she never used since the brake line incident. She was asleep when he took the keys. He left a note she'd never find. The warehouse sat in the woods like a scar, silent, grey, and still half-eaten by vines. The main doors groaned as they pushed open, metal against rust. Kane walked in first. No hesitation, his head low, ears rotating. Zack's boots crunched behind him, echoing in the hollow space. It was exactly how they'd left it. But Kane moved with purpose now, bypassing the stairwell, sniffing near the loading dock instead. He stopped at a section of wall and let out a short, sharp bark. Zack blinked. "What is it?" Kane pressed a paw against the concrete, then backed up. Zack ran his hand along the wall until he found it, a thin metal seam, a trapdoor. He knelt, found the latch, and heaved it open. The stink hit first. Not mold, not rot, ammonia, chemicals, and something worse underneath. He lowered himself in, carefully, Kane jumping down beside him with practiced grace. The space beneath was smaller than the basement, an auxiliary bunker maybe. The walls were insulated with thick foam, soundproof. There were no cages this time. There were beds, 6 of them, metal-framed, thin mattresses, all stained. Zack's breath hitched as he stepped forward. Kane moved slowly behind him, nose to the floor, tail stiff. There were still blankets on some bunks, shoes, a broken pair of headphones. A forgotten drawing, crayons on cardboard, the image of a dog and a boy holding hands. In the corner sat a small cabinet, half open. Inside, Zack found bottles, sedatives labeled in code, plastic wristbands, files in sealed folders. He opened one. Each page had a photo, a name, age, behavior notes. Assigned K9 unit. Every child matched a dog. Zack's stomach turned. The last folder didn't have a name, just a label. Unrehabilitated. Containment recommended. The photo was blurred, a face scratched out, but the scar behind the ear was unmistakable. Kane. Zack. Drop the folder. They called you unrehabilitated because you didn't let them turn you into a weapon. Kane sat quietly beside him. Then his head snapped up. A sound echoed above them. Muffled footsteps. Fast. They weren't alone. Zack scrambled up the ladder, Kane bounding past him, growling low. In the warehouse above, 2 men in plain clothes stood near the door, one holding a walkie, the other a long baton. Both froze when they saw Kane. "Is that—" Before the second man finished, Kane lunged. Zack didn't see the impact, just heard the crash of bodies hitting concrete and the shouts that followed. He moved to the side, grabbing the dropped walkie, smashing it underfoot. The second man turned toward him, eyes wild, but Kane was already circling back. He didn't maul, didn't kill. He pinned, held, defended. By the time Zack got to the door, both men were unconscious or nearly so. Kane stood over them, breathing hard. Sirens sounded in the distance. Zack turned to Kane. "We need proof." Kane led him back to the trapdoor. Zack snapped photos, filmed the files, the beds, the walls, every item they'd missed the first time. Then he uploaded it from his phone to 3 different locations, Elena, the cloud drive, and a USB backup. Only then did he hear tires. Outside, more than 1 car. "Go," he said to Kane. But Kane didn't move. Instead, he stood between Zack and the warehouse door, teeth bared. Then from outside, a voice shouted through a bullhorn, "Come out now! Hands above your head!" Zack froze. "They called the cops?" he whispered. Another voice, not a cop, shouted over the first, "That boy has stolen government property. We are authorized to detain," Kane growled. Zack whispered, "We're not walking out of here." He grabbed the USB, shoved it into his back pocket, and looked for an exit. Then Kane did something unexpected. He turned and sprinted toward the back. Zack followed without thinking, ducking through the broken frame of a service door and into the trees. Gunshots cracked behind them, but none came close. They ran until the warehouse was gone, the trees thick, the sky growing dark. I covered a story on a local rehab center that had ties to private corrections. Same thing happened. My emails disappeared. I started getting followed. My editor told me to back off. What did you do? I didn't. 2 weeks later, they shut us down for violating student journalism policies. Zack looked at her. This is bigger than Kane, bigger than us. Elena nodded. That's why we need more than words. She opened an old program she hadn't touched in months, a hack tool, crude but effective. Within 15 minutes, she'd breached a backdoor into the cloud server once used by the now-defunct K9 program. It wasn't protected well. That was the first warning sign. They want people to find this, she said, "but only the stuff that doesn't matter." "What do you mean?" "Look." She clicked through layers of folders, training logs, supply receipts, generic emails, all clean, too clean. But then she found it, a hidden directory buried behind a file labeled Archived Orientation Slides. Inside were 6 video files, each named with a date and a number. No context. She opened the first one. It was grainy, black and white. The camera was fixed in the corner of a cold, narrow room. A boy sat hunched on a metal bench, no older than 13. A man entered, face obscured. He spoke in a low voice, inaudible through the recording. The boy flinched. The man pointed. Kane entered from the side. His body was stiff, muzzled, guided by a leash held by someone off-screen. The boy cried out. Kane didn't attack, didn't growl. He just stood there, breathing hard, every part of him straining against something invisible. Zack reached for the mouse. "Play the next one." Elena hesitated, then clicked. This time, it was different. 2 boys in a hallway lined with mats, one bleeding from the lip. A third figure, masked, shouted something. Kane appeared again, this time unmuzzled, pushed forward. One of the boys reached out to touch him. Kane didn't move. Then he lunged, not at the boy, but at the man who shouted. The camera shook. Alarms blared. The feed cut out. Elena sat back slowly. He wasn't obeying them. He was protecting them, Zack whispered. She opened the rest. Some had been corrupted. Others showed footage of boys tied to chairs, a bright light on them, with Kane sitting motionless nearby. Sometimes his body shook. Sometimes he stared at the ceiling, eyes glazed. But always, there was a tension beneath his silence, like he was being held just below the surface. The last file showed him dragging something across the floor. It wasn't a weapon. It was a child, wounded, barely moving. Kane laid him against a wall, stood between the boy and a figure approaching with a baton, and growled low. The clip cut out just before contact. Zack pushed away from the desk. Why would they film this? Control, Elena said. Documentation, maybe even proof. To scare someone off. They didn't expect anyone to leak it. She turned back to the screen. There's an encrypted folder here. Might be personnel files, maybe more video. I'll need time. Can you copy it? Already doing it. Zack stood, pacing. If we leak this, if people see what Kane saw, it could burn the whole thing down, Elena finished, but it'll paint us as the ones who started the fire. That night, Zack visited the shelter. The building was quiet, lights dimmed. Rourke gave a small nod from the front office, but didn't ask questions. Zack moved to the kennel and sat down in front of Kane. He said nothing at first. Then, "We saw it. The files, the kids. You trying to stop them." Kane's ears twitched. Zack leaned forward. "I don't know how you survived it, but I swear to you, I'm going to finish what you couldn't, no matter what it takes." Kane moved closer, slowly, until his head touched the bars. Zack didn't pull away. The room was silent except for their breathing. One boy, one dog, both witnesses, both survivors, both ready. Zack didn't plan to steal Kane. It just happened. One moment he was watching him sleep behind the wire gate, and the next he was turning the latch with trembling fingers. It wasn't impulse. It was necessity. The files were downloaded, the videos backed up, and the police still refused to act. The shelter was now under pressure to transfer Kane to another facility, one with stricter containment protocols. Zack knew what that meant. Kane wouldn't make it out. They left just before dawn. No alarms. There were children in cages. You said were, not are. Zack's hands clenched at his sides. So because it's not happening right this second, you won't do anything? It's not my jurisdiction, Reynolds said, folding his hands. On the desk. If you're serious about this, you should talk to the police. I did. That part came out lower. Bitter. Because he had. That morning, right after they got back from the facility, he'd gone to the station, demanded to speak with someone. An officer took his statement, barely looked up, then handed him a number for mental health support, said a counselor would be in touch. the same tone they used for drug cases and disturbed kids. That thin, polite condescension that screamed, "We think you're full of it." At home that night, his mom didn't say a word about the strange car that had idled outside the house for half an hour. Didn't question why Zack kept checking the blinds, or why the back door was locked twice. She just went through the motions: quiet dinner, muted TV, an empty stare. Like she was slipping further into the space where people stopped asking questions. He couldn't talk to her, not anymore. At school, Elena had her phone stolen, her email hacked. Someone had posted a doctored photo of her, something cruel, ugly, designed to discredit her in the most public way. She didn't flinch. She marched right to the principal's office with a copy of the original photo, screenshots of the threats, and a flash drive full of evidence that her laptop had been breached. Nothing happened, no investigation, no apology. Instead, a rumor began to spread that she'd faked the whole thing for attention, that she and Zack were obsessed with conspiracy garbage and making trouble for people who protect the community. That week, someone tried to break into the shelter. It happened just after closing. Rourke called Zack the next morning. He sounded shaken. "The lock was busted. Nothing stolen, but Kane's cage was open. Was he hurt?" "No," Rourke said. "But he wasn't in his cage when I got there. He was outside, waiting by the front door, like he was guarding the place, like he was guarding you." Zack sat in stunned silence for a moment, then whispered, "I think they're trying to erase him." Rourke didn't answer right away. Then, "Whatever you've stumbled into, kid, back out. You're not built for this, I think." "Kane thinks I am." That night, Zack and Elena sat in the dark behind the high school gym, parked where no cameras could see them. Elena held a flash drive in her lap, their backup of everything from the basement, the documents, the photos, the coordinates, and the files Messer gave them. "If we send this to the right person," she said, "we might still have a shot." "Who's the right person?" Zack asked. "We already tried the cops, the school. No one wants this to be real." "Then we go higher," Elena said. "There's a journalist I follow. Works for a non-profit that investigates child abuse. Cases, real stuff. They've taken down programs before." Zack nodded slowly. "But we can't use our names." "We won't." She opened a burner email, attached the folder, and hovered her finger over send. "You sure?" she asked. Zack looked at the night sky. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he nodded. "Kane can't speak for himself, so we do it. For him." She clicked send. A second later, it was gone. Back at the shelter, Kane sat in his kennel, eyes fixed on the hallway beyond the glass. The lights had been turned off, but his ears twitched at every sound. Somewhere in the dark, he sensed something changing. Not safety, but movement. Zack had chosen not to run, and Kane, for the first time in years, didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, the email bounced back. No delivery confirmation, no error code, just vanished, like it had never been sent at all. Elena tried a second account, same result. Then a third, routed through a VPN. That one didn't bounce, but there was no reply either, just silence. Zack sat at her desk while she worked, watching the screen like it might blink back a signal. His phone buzzed twice. Unknown number, no voicemail. Then again. 4 times in 20 minutes. He powered it off and tossed it face down. "They're filtering us," Elena said. "They're scrubbing the traffic before it gets out. I've only seen this once before." "When?" 2 years ago. Forced to obey. But then the memory changed. Zack was there too, not in reality, not in a way he could explain, but he could see it all through Kane's eyes. Smells, shapes, the vibration of pain running through every bone. He saw the face of the masked man again, only now it was closer, sharper, and in the background a boy screaming. It wasn't a dream, he knew that now. He wasn't just remembering Kane's past, he was inside it. When he got to school, Elena was already waiting by his locker. Her expression told him everything. She hadn't slept either. "You look like hell," she said quietly. "So do you." They didn't joke after that. During third period, Zack couldn't focus. The chalk squeaked across the board, the same. Formula repeated in 5 rows, but it all blurred into meaningless lines. Every time he blinked, the cages came back. His pen trembled in his hand. Elena glanced over once, saw his knuckles white around it, and didn't ask. She didn't need to. After school, they rode out to the address Messer had given them. An old industrial road led into the woods, paved once but now overgrown with weeds and cracked like broken skin. A chain-link gate, rusted and sagging, blocked the entrance. Zack pushed it open without hesitation. The facility wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a lab. It looked like a warehouse that had given up. Long walls of concrete slouched inward, windows shattered, vines creeping into the frame like veins. A faded logo flaked from the front wall, 3 stars and a sword. They walked slowly. Inside, the air changed. It was cooler, damp, and carried a sour chemical scent that clung to the back of the throat. Graffiti covered most of the visible surfaces. Someone had tried to erase what the place was, but some things wouldn't go. Zack followed a hallway toward a rusted door. Something pulled at him, not memory, instinct. He reached out and opened it. The basement was real. Concrete stairs led downward into darkness. No lights, no sound. They descended carefully, phone flashlights cutting small cones through the thick air. The walls down here were different. Painted once, now peeled away to reveal smooth, stain-slick stone. Metal brackets still jutted out at intervals. Chains hung from some of them. Others were empty. Zack walked slowly past the first chamber, then the second. By the third, he couldn't breathe. Elena was shaking beside him, not from cold. "We have to document this, every inch," he nodded. They found an office deeper in the basement, files burned in metal bins, some pages scorched but not destroyed. Elena dug through them with surgical precision, and then they found it. A photograph, Kane, sitting in front of a line of cages, 3 boys visible. One had a swollen eye, another had his knees pulled to his chest. The third, his face had been scratched out with ink. On the back, in small, neat print, Cohort 4, Session 3, Response. Training with K9 Unit 6. Zack stared at it for a long time. "This happened," he said. "All of it. Still happening," Elena replied. "There are more kids, or there were." He looked around the ruined room. "They erased it, but Kane didn't." Elena stared at him. "You really saw it, didn't you? Through him?" Zack didn't answer. He didn't have to. On the way out, they passed another door, steel, bolted but broken at the hinges. Scratches lined the inside wall, deep, angry. Some ran all the way down to the floor, claw marks. Kane had fought here, and somehow, even after everything, he'd survived. Back at the shelter that evening, Zack stood in front of Kane's kennel. The dog looked up slowly, his gaze steady, tired, but unbroken. Zack crouched and whispered, "I saw it. I saw what they did." Kane didn't move, but his ears twitched, and Zack knew, for the first time, they weren't alone anymore. Zack stood in the principal's office for the second time that week, except this time he wasn't in trouble. He was trying to report a crime. He waited while Mr. Reynolds pretended to read through his folder, flipping pages slowly, as if the delay might wear Zack down. "I'm telling you the truth," Zack said, voice steady but strained. "There's a facility north of Wabash. They use dogs to control kids. Kane was one of them. It's all still there. Chains, cages, files." Mr. Reynolds finally looked up. "You and Miss Chavez trespassed on private property?" Zack blinked. "You're not hearing me." Then footsteps, slow, shuffling. The door creaked open. The man who stood behind it looked like he hadn't spoken to another human in weeks. Thin, unshaven, eyes sunken and bloodshot, but his frame was unmistakably military, still upright even, in exhaustion. He stared at Zack and Elena with a wariness that ran deeper than suspicion. "I'm not looking for trouble," Zack said quickly. We just need to ask about Kane, the dog. The man froze. Zack saw it, the tremble in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened on the doorframe. I don't know what you're talking about, Messer said flatly. We've seen the records, Elena said, stepping forward. The K9 unit, the kids, the warehouse facility. We know you signed the transfer. Messer looked between them, then stepped aside. 5 minutes, he said, then you're gone. Inside was chaos. Piles of old clothes, newspapers, coffee mugs with dried stains, prescription bottles scattered. Across the kitchen counter, a framed photo lay face down on the table. Zack picked it up without thinking. It was Messer. And Kane, younger, stronger. Kane wore a vest labeled Police Unit 4. That was before, Messer said, his voice cracking. Before they took him. Zack lowered the photo. What happened? Messer collapsed into the only chair in the room that wasn't buried under clutter. He looked older than his years, as if every word he was about to say had weighed him down. For decades, I was part of a joint task force, state-run, privately funded. It was supposed to be about rehabilitation, juvenile corrections through structure, order. They called it the Valor Initiative. Sounds patriotic, right? But it was a lie, a cover. Elena leaned forward. What did they do? They took troubled teens, runaways, delinquents, kids without records, and turned them into test subjects. They called it conditioning, breaking the cycle. But it was abuse, isolation, sensory deprivation, punishment disguised as training. Zack's voice was barely audible. And the dogs? They used K9s as enforcers, but Kane was different. He didn't just obey. He watched, understood. The kids, some of them tried to reach him. One boy slipped him food through the bars. Another used to hum to him at night. Kane never forgot them. Not one. Messer's hands trembled now. The final year, something changed. Kane snapped. He attacked one of the instructors. Not because he lost control, but because a kid was being taken away. He lunged straight through a steel gate. They beat him nearly to death. That's when I knew I had to get him out. But you didn't, Zack said. Messer looked at the floor. They found out. They threatened my family. I signed the transfer forms, said Kane was too unstable for duty. Next thing I know, the program disappears. The facility's abandoned. The dogs vanish. The kids are written off as missing or runaways. And you disappeared with them, Elena said. I couldn't live with what I saw. I still can't. A long silence stretched in the room. Zack finally asked, Do you know where the facility was? Messer nodded slowly. It's buried now, but I remember. Every turn, he reached for a pad and scribbled an address. I don't know what you don't think you'll find, he said, handing it over. But Kane, he remembers. That's what scares them. Zack looked him in the eyes. It should. As they stepped outside, a cold gust whipped through the trees. Elena was quiet until they reached the car. Zack, this thing goes deeper than I thought. He didn't answer. He just stared at the address in his hand. Kane wasn't just a victim. He was a witness to something monstrous, and now Zack had names, faces, and a target. Zack didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke, his throat was dry, and his hands were clenched into fists. The light in his room was dim, early morning trying to push its way through the blinds. He sat up too fast, chest tight, the edge of a scream still caught in his breath. His sheets were twisted, soaked in sweat. It wasn't the usual nightmare, the kind that fades when the sun comes. This one stayed behind. He remembered everything, the hallway lined with doors, cold, metallic, numbered in red, the clicking of boots on concrete, the sound of kids breathing too hard in dark corners, trying not to cry out, and the cages stacked like shipping containers, some barely large enough to crouch in. Kane had been there, not behind bars, but walking between them, muzzled, controlled. Bank records stopped cold a week later. Zack leaned over the papers. You think he knew something? I think he tried to make it disappear. But maybe he knew too much to stay quiet. The next day, Zack's mom nearly drove into an intersection. When the brakes failed, the mechanic said the lines had been cut deliberately. She brushed it off. assuming it was rust or neglect, but Zack felt the blood drain from his face when he overheard her on the phone. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was escalation. That night, he returned to the shelter during operating hours. Rourke was there, going through intake forms. Zack's eyes kept drifting to the end of the corridor where Kane lay, silent as ever. Rourke looked up. "You don't have a shift tonight." "I know," Zack said, stepping closer to the desk. "I need to ask about Kane." Rourke's eyes darkened. "He's not up for adoption." "I'm not trying to adopt him. I just need to know where he came from. He was transferred here by animal control. No paperwork, no history. Just showed up in the middle of the night like they wanted him forgotten." "Who's they?" Rourke hesitated. "Sometimes you don't ask, especially when a dog like that shows up covered in scars, refusing to eat, and flinches every time someone wears a uniform." Zack nodded slowly, his voice tight. "You said not to provoke him." "Because I did once," Rourke said. "Reached in too fast. He didn't bite, but he pinned me to the wall like he knew how to break me if he wanted. Then he backed off and looked me in the eye, like he was telling me it wasn't personal. Just reflex." Zack looked down the hall again. Kane wasn't moving, but he was watching, always watching. Later that night, Elena called. Her voice was shaking but controlled. "I found something else. I think you need to see it." He biked to her house under a sky heavy with clouds. In her room, the glow of her laptop lit up a wall of digital newspaper clippings. One headline stood out: "Anonymous source alleges juvenile training program hidden in decommissioned facility." "What is this?" Zack asked, reading quickly. "A report that never went anywhere, buried after a week. But I found the source. Metadata in a university database. It's signed with the initials DM, David Messer." She nodded. "And get this, the source mentioned animals used for intimidation. Canine compliance reinforcement. That's not police talk. That's lab talk." Zack sat down hard. "They were using dogs on kids? I think Kane wasn't just a victim. I think he was a witness." A sound outside cut through the room, tires screeching, fast acceleration. Elena rushed to the window. A car had peeled away from the curb, an unmarked black sedan. "No plates," she muttered. "They're watching us again." "Then we move." "Faster," she said. Zack looked back at her. "We're in this now, aren't we?" "Yeah," she said quietly, "and it's not just about a dog anymore." Kane lay curled in his cage that night, eyes open, breathing slow. Somewhere deep in his mind, the sounds returned. The metal doors, the screams, the sting of the chain. But then, something different stirred. A voice, gentle, hesitant, Zack's. The boy who once mocked him had touched the truth. And Kane knew that meant the boy would soon face the same darkness. They drove an hour north without saying much. The silence between Zack and Elena wasn't awkward. It was focused. They were chasing a ghost. Captain David Messer, the name behind the transfers. The man who'd quietly vanished after the K9 unit dissolved. His name had turned up on a retirement record tied to a veteran's home outside of Wabash. That was their first lead. And maybe their only one. Elena clutched a printout in her lap as they pulled into the cracked parking lot of the facility. The building looked tired. Faded bricks, peeling paint, a sagging awning over the main entrance. Zack parked behind an old pickup and glanced at her. "You ready?" "No," she muttered, "but let's go." The front desk attendant was young, maybe college-aged, and barely looked up from her phone when Zack asked, "We're looking for a resident named David Messer." She blinked, chewing gum. "Building 3, apartment 2B, if he answers." Walk to building 3 felt longer than it was. Cold air and cracked pavement underfoot, wind slicing through their jackets. Zack knocked twice, no answer. He was about to knock again when they heard it, the sound of metal dragging across the floor. Her eyes were harder than he remembered, but not unreadable. "What?" "I need your help." That caught her off guard. "Help! There's a dog at the shelter, a K9, German Shepherd. His name's Kane. He's not normal." That's a weird way to start a conversation. He was in some kind of basement. I saw it. I touched his scar and... He stopped himself. He sounded crazy. I know how it sounds, but I got a photo. Someone's threatening me. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. A photo of what? He looked around. The courtyard was mostly empty. He pulled his phone from his pocket, showed her a picture of the original photo he'd taken before hiding it. Elena's face changed instantly. Is this real? She asked quietly. He nodded. And you're just now telling someone? I didn't know who else to trust. Elena leaned back. Okay, let's pretend for a second I believe you. You think this dog came from where? A fighting ring? No, worse. Zack lowered his voice. I think he was part of something official, something big, and then they shut it down and buried it. Elena stared at the photo again. That's not a regular kennel, that's industrial. And the guy in the mask, he's not just some creep. He looked like he belonged there. A silence passed between them, heavy and full. Zack finally said, You know how to find things. You always did. Elena looked at him long and hard. You're not off the hook for what you did, but if this is real, I'm in. He didn't smile, but he felt something shift. By that evening, they were at her place. Her bedroom was a controlled chaos of books, hard drives, and crime scene boards with strings connecting headlines. She opened her laptop and began digging. Records of missing K9 units, unexplained police resignations, mentions of a defunct training facility upstate that went dark 2 years ago. She paused on one article. This might be something. It was a small-town news blip about a department that had shut down its K9 division overnight. 6 dogs unaccounted for. No explanation, no follow-up. Kane, Zack said, and 5 others. Elena looked over. At him. Why would someone want to erase them? He didn't know. Not yet. But he was starting to feel the edge of something massive. As they scrolled deeper, Elena stopped suddenly. A file had been deleted. Government server. But the deletion log was messy. Sloppy. She clicked through and found a ghost entry. Transfer. Redacted. Classified, clearance only. The destination address wasn't government. It was private, corporate. Zack leaned in. What kind of shelter needs classified clearance? The question hung in the room like smoke. That night, as Zack walked home, he felt the air move differently, lighter, not safer, but clearer. He wasn't imagining things. Kane had a past, and now they were chasing it, even if someone didn't want them to. It started with Zack's locker. The door was bent inward like someone had kicked it. The lock warped just enough to jam. Inside, his books were soaked in something, sticky and foul. At the very bottom, resting against the shredded pages of his algebra notebook, was a small bone. Too clean, too deliberate. He stood staring at it for a long time before slowly shutting the door. No one saw who did it. No one ever did, but he knew it wasn't a prank. Whoever had followed him, whoever left the photo, was sending another message. That same afternoon, Elena found her windshield smashed, nothing stolen, just a piece of rebar left balanced on the driver's seat with a note taped to it. Rot. With him, they were being watched, followed. Someone wanted them quiet. Zack didn't go to the police. He already knew how that would go, the same way it had when the video surfaced. Lip service. Avoidance. The same system that gave him shelter duty instead of a criminal record wasn't going to protect him now. And this, whatever this was bigger than vandalism. When he told Elena what happened at his locker, she was quiet for a long time. Then she pulled a file from her backpack, one she hadn't shown him yet. Look at this, she said, spreading out copies of documents she'd traced from archived news clippings. The guy who signed off on the K9 transfers? Captain David Messer. He retired the same month the dogs disappeared. No ceremony, no statement. And then he vanished. Vanished? No one knows where he went. His house is empty. Neighbors said a moving truck came, but no one ever saw him leave. Elena passed him in the corridor with her head turned slightly away. Even now, weeks later, he felt like a ghost haunting a place where his life used to be. When the final bell rang, Zack didn't go home. He walked. past the school, past the gas station, past the point where the sidewalk stopped. He needed air, needed distance from the locker whispers and the shelter in his head. Maybe Kane had done something to him. Maybe he was losing it. But somewhere beneath the confusion, there was something else. A pull, not from guilt, not from curiosity, from a place deeper, darker, stranger than either. By the time he looped back toward his house, the sun had dipped behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the neighborhood like fingers. He was halfway up the block when he noticed the SUV. It was parked across the street from his yard. Black windows, no plates. It hadn't been there before. Zack slowed, heart ticking up. The engine wasn't running. The car didn't move. He stepped onto his driveway. That's when the window on the SUV cracked open. Just a sliver. Not enough to see a face. Something fluttered from inside and landed on the grass. Then the window rolled back up and the SUV drove off. No screech, no rush. Just a slow, deliberate turn of the tires until it disappeared around the corner. Zack stood frozen. He crossed the yard slowly, the air around him suddenly dense. It was an envelope, yellow, thick, no name. He picked it up. Inside was a single photograph. His fingers trembled. It was Kane. Not in the shelter, not behind a gate. He was lying on a concrete floor, chained at the neck, blood seeping from his side. His eyes were open, wide and unfocused. Behind him, just out of the camera's flash, stood a man, face hidden under a mask, black, tight, featureless, gloved hands, boots planted in a puddle of something dark. There was no date, no writing, just the image. But on the back of the photo, scrawled in red marker, were two words: "Stop remembering." Zack's stomach dropped. He looked up, scanning the street, but it was empty now, completely still. The photo slipped from his hand. He backed toward the door, heart hammering harder than it ever had in any fight, any football game, any memory. Inside, he locked the door behind him and checked it twice. He didn't tell his mother. She wouldn't hear him anyway. He didn't eat dinner, couldn't even look at the plate when she finally slid it onto the table. In his room, the photograph burned in his mind like a brand. The chain around Kane's neck, the mask. The blood, it wasn't a threat, it was a message. He knew someone else knew that he knew. That night, Zack didn't sleep. Every shadow in his room stretched too long. Every branch outside scratched the glass like it had a purpose. He stared at the ceiling and thought about the photo, about Kane, about the way the dog had looked at him, like he wasn't a stranger, like he'd seen him before, not in person, in pain. Zack didn't know what any of it meant, but he knew this. He wasn't the predator anymore. Someone else was watching, and this time he was the prey. Zack hadn't said a word all morning. Not during breakfast, not on the way to school, not when Elena walked past him in the hallway like he wasn't even there. He could still feel the envelope in his pocket, even though he'd hidden it under a loose floorboard in his room. The image kept flashing behind his eyes. Kane bleeding, chained, the masked man standing like a shadow pulled from some horror show. But what rattled him most wasn't the violence. It was the message. Stop remembering. He hadn't remembered anything, not really, not consciously, but whoever sent that photo thought he had. That meant something more dangerous. They were watching him, maybe had been for longer than he realized. At lunch, he finally snapped. Elena was eating alone at a bench in the far corner of the quad. She was typing something on her laptop, probably another story for the school's underground news blog. She'd gotten popular again after her piece about the school board's hypocrisy over his punishment went viral. The irony wasn't lost on him. He stood at the edge of her table, throat dry. "I need to talk." She didn't look up. "Go. Away. I'm serious. You usually are when you're humiliating people. I'm not that guy anymore." "Cool. I'm still not your friend." Zack sat down anyway. Elena sighed and finally looked at him. But something more human, something Zack had seen before, in the mirror, in the moments after the hallway emptied and the video played on someone else's phone. that look of knowing exactly who you've become and not liking it. He moved through the hallway quietly. The kennels were still, most dogs asleep, tails twitching in restless dreams. But at the end, under the low red glow of the emergency light, Kane was awake. He was lying down this time, but not resting. His body was tense, eyes open, chest rising too fast, whimpering, not loudly, but just enough to catch in the air. Zack stepped closer, his shoes careful against the tile. Kane twitched, paws shifting, jaws clenched. Whatever he was seeing, it wasn't the kennel. He whimpered again, louder now, eyes still closed. Zack reached out without thinking. His hand hesitated. Above the latch, then settled on the gate. "Hey," he said softly. "You're dreaming, huh?" Kane jerked, not awake, still trapped in whatever horror played behind his eyes. Another low cry escaped his throat. Something deeper this time, more cracked. Zack didn't know why he did it. He just did. He crouched down and rested his palm against the bars. "Hey," he whispered more gently. "It's not real. It's not now." Kane stirred, breathing, hitching. "I know what that feels like," Zack murmured, fingers brushing the gate, "being stuck in your head." And just like that, the shepherd opened his eyes. For a breathless second, they stared at each other. Kane didn't move, didn't growl. He just looked. Zack swallowed and slowly slid his hand through the bars, not to poke, not to test, just to touch. His fingers rested against Kane's back, near the scar. Kane didn't flinch. The tremble in his body stilled. Zack felt it before he saw it. A pulse of something cold, sharp, electric, not a jolt, nothing physical. Just a sudden, vivid image bursting through his mind. His chest tightened, his hand shot back. He saw cages, dozens of them, cold steel, damp floors. The walls were painted. Concrete, grey, peeling, fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and a sound, low, humming, mechanical, fans, industrial ones. Then children, not playing, not talking, locked in those cages. Their eyes were dull, some cried, some didn't. A figure moved in the background, tall, hooded, face hidden behind a black mask, and in one corner, behind a set of metal bars, stood Kane, chained, bleeding, and then it was gone. Zack gasped and stumbled back, hand to his chest, head spinning. Kane stood slowly behind the bars, eyes never leaving him. Not aggressive, not challenging, just waiting. Zack looked around the hallway, but nothing had changed. The other dogs slept. The shelter hummed softly with its old vents and distant pipes. But he was shaking. That vision, it hadn't been a dream, not his, not Kane's. It had come from somewhere else, somewhere real. He backed away slowly. Didn't run, just walked, one step at a time, until he was out of the kennel wing, out of the building, climbing the fence again under a moonless sky. On the other side, the wind felt different, sharper, like it knew he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to, something he couldn't ignore now. Back in the shelter, Kane sat down again. The red light flickered above his cage. He didn't lie down this time. He stayed upright, ears twitching toward the silence, as if waiting for something else to return, not sleep, not safety. Just a signal. Zack had seen it now, and Kane had finally been heard. The morning fog hadn't lifted by the time Zack walked to school, but something in him already felt exposed. The streets were quiet, houses still with curtains drawn, but every sound, the squeak of his bike brakes, the rattle of his backpack zipper, felt louder than it should. His eyes kept checking corners. He told himself it was nothing, that it was all in his head. That dogs don't show people visions, and kids don't get chained up in basements, and that whatever he saw last night had to be a stress dream. But the image wouldn't leave. The cages, the boys staring through rusted bars, Kane, bleeding, and silent in a pool of light too bright for comfort. That scar behind his ear, it wasn't just a wound, it was a mark, a memory etched into fur. Zack had touched it, and something inside him had snapped awake. At school, the halls were the same. Grey blur as always. The stares hadn't stopped since the video. No one spoke to him. Teachers barely looked up. The kind that bites through your hoodie and settles under your skin. Zack walked back to the shelter with slow feet and a blank stare. He didn't care if he was late. No one was waiting for him. Not at home. Not here. His mother barely looked up anymore when he left the house. It was easier to just let things rot. He checked in without speaking. Rourke wasn't at the desk today. Just the older woman again. Judith or Janet, he didn't care to remember. She handed him a mop without saying a word. He made his way to the back, but his thoughts were already ahead of him. Right to the end of the kennel corridor, right to Kane. The dog was still in the same position, as if he hadn't moved in 24 hours. Zack stood in front of his cage and stared. "Still think you're better than me?" Kane didn't react. His eyes were steady, but something in them had changed. The stillness wasn't calm. It was braced, as if he expected something. Zack narrowed his eyes and crouched again, this time closer, fingers resting against the mesh. "I bet you were some big-shot police dog, huh? All proud and shiny, sniffing bombs and chasing guys. What happened? You screw up? Bite the wrong guy?" Kane shifted, barely. His ears lowered, eyes narrowing just enough for Zack to notice. It wasn't fear, it was a warning. Zack's voice hardened. "You think you're special? You're nothing but a mutt with a busted brain." He poked a finger through the gate, straight toward the scar under Kane's ear. The reaction was instant. Kane lunged, not forward, but up, his head slamming into the gate with a deep, rumbling growl that stopped Zack cold. It wasn't barked. Anger. It wasn't snarling rage. It was something else, something primal, controlled, calculated. A sound that didn't come from a dog trying to scare you, but from one that knew exactly what you were. Zack fell back on the concrete, palms scraped, heart hammering in his chest, his eyes locked with Kane's through the gate. The growl had stopped as quickly as it started. The shepherd's face was calm again, too calm. As if nothing had happened, a shadow passed over them both. "What did I tell you?" Rourke stood at the corridor entrance, arms crossed, his face like stone. Zack got to his feet, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I didn't touch him. Didn't have to. He doesn't bark at just anything." Zack straightened. "It's a dog." Rourke stepped closer, his eyes on Kane. "That dog's seen more hell than you ever will. If he warns you, you listen. You don't poke. You don't push. Got it?" Zack said nothing. Rourke sighed and turned away. "Clean the floors. Don't go near him again." Zack mumbled something under his breath and picked up the mop, but all through the next hour, through the scrubbing, the bleach, the wet footprints that never seemed to dry, his mind kept drifting back. Not to Kane's growl, but to what came after. The silence, the stillness, the way those dark eyes never blinked. Zack had seen fights before, had been in them. He knew the difference between a dog barking to scare you and one preparing to tear you apart. But Kane hadn't barked. He hadn't snapped. It was almost like he'd recognized something. That night, Zack lay in bed with the ceiling staring back at him. The house creaked in the wind. A leaky faucet clicked rhythmically in the kitchen, and the silence pressed in from every wall. He saw the scar again, felt the thud of the gate rattling under Kane's weight. But what shook him more than the growl was what he remembered in that brief second afterward. There was something in Kane's face, something that looked a lot like pain. The shelter was closed. Lights off, doors locked. Wind whispered through the parking lot, rustling a crumpled flyer near the chain-link gate. Zack knew better, but rules had started meaning less and less lately. He climbed the side fence with the silence of someone who'd snuck out before, someone who had no one waiting to notice. His sneakers hit the gravel with a soft thud. He hesitated for a moment, eyes scanning the dark windows, before slipping in through the staff entrance he'd seen Judith forget to lock earlier that day. It wasn't guilt that brought him back. Not entirely. Curiosity, maybe. Something he didn't have a name for. That growl had haunted him, not just the sound, but the way it sat in his chest afterward, like a memory he couldn't place. That scar behind Kane's ear. That look he gave, Not fear, not rage.